So once we have our kingdom set up, it's time to start to play. For the glory!
Welcome to my journey creating a show-accurate version of Card Wars from Adventure Time. I'll give you a recap, so don't worry if you aren't caught up. But first, the fully public alpha playtest is available right now in the Steam Workshop for Tabletop Simulator. There is already a community post with a link. The game currently has a functioning turn structure, a setup system to build quick and semi-random decks, over 80 cards including tons of community art features, combat that resolves all at once in a land, simulated creature behaviors that allow creatures to do things like throw tantrums at random times, and an economy system that lets you force auctions. If you're interested in playing it yourself, the last video helps explain some of the rules visually, but there is also a full rules PDF in the game mod itself. In this video, I'll be covering my analysis and plans for land cards, as well as reassessing my implementation of worker placement, since even if it works, it doesn't really hit all the checks to be real worker placement or show accurate. So we finally arrive at land cards. While it was obviously my decision, it's weird that I had the economy fleshed out before I began on this. I don't know, I probably had a reason. The mechanics surrounding land cards need to be incredibly elegant and non-invasive, but generally, mechanics as simple as the land cards will have to be actually take even more work to get right. It's been a while since we've done some good old-fashioned episode analysis, so I figure I can start with that. It shouldn't be surprising, but there isn't actually a lot of information given to us about how lands work. Land cards. Okay, new game terminology for clarity's sake. This space on the board is a land, and it is considered a land whether or not it has a land card beneath it. This is a land card, which goes in the land row of cards like in the show, which projects its abilities onto its corresponding land, but has its own health. Essentially what I'm saying is that these two things are defined separately and can be affected separately. Back on track. After setup, both Finn and Jake have 4 land cards, and in general, land cards seem to be pretty ubiquitous, which sort of implies that lacking a land card in a lane might make the land itself defunct. So that means you need land cards. But, Jake, how do I get my land on the map?
Oh, you, floop your land cards.
Thanks, Jake. When you floop the land cards, like Jake said, not only do the landscapes appear holographically onto the board, but so do most of the other creatures and structures in the same lane. I say most because obviously there are random exceptions and things that only appear when either Finn and Jake interacts with them, but that's a storytelling device since otherwise the viewer would be getting way too much information all at once, unlike me who loves giving too much information. But what matters about this is that it implies that things cannot exist in lands with no flooped land card, which I will call empty lands. This isn't necessarily fact, however, because it's possible to interpret it as that no cards can be placed onto empty lands and that it just works this way because of the order of operations during setup. These are doors I like to leave open for myself, but it definitely means no playing cards into empty lands. Land cards themselves each refer to one of 16 themed elements. Jake technically says the lanes are derived from the elements, but this doesn't really line up with everything else we're presented with in the show, so I'll just assume that Jake misspoke. You have lands like empty field, wheat field, useless swamp, and of course, cornfields. Now, I'll break down the cards themselves since the function is pretty clear. All the land cards we see have a name and a number and generally no other text. This isn't actually weird given the information we have. The main influence we see the lands have in the show is when Jake's cornfields buff his corn creatures. These effects are on the creatures themselves and not actually on the land cards. We can see, however, that some land cards actually do have text, like the aforementioned wheat field. Its description appears to reference an activation cost for enemy cards, but what's weird is that this ability doesn't really have anything to do with itself or the land. It's just a crazy debuff to the enemy for some reason. Now, what does the number mean? The main 3 meanings a number can have in a card game are cost, attack, and health. However, I've seen some people outlining ideas for a point-buy system where the lands you choose affecting what you're able to put on the board. That said, there isn't anything I've seen that's super concrete, and it would add a lot of time and complexity to set up. So for simplicity, I'll be treating it as health for now, although this would be an easy thing to adjust later. So honestly, I could just leave land cards at that. Simple features that elemental cards are affected by and that affect the game with passive effects. But personally, I want more out of them, and there are a lot of hints at further functions. Besides, Wheatfield's ability is so invasive and powerful, there has to be a way for your opponent to deal with it somehow. To clarify how cost and/or activation cost works in the game currently, when a card costs 1, it means that on top of exhausting it to activate or floop it, you also have to flip over other cards you have on the board face down, which makes them vulnerable. So if you ported it into my game directly, the opponent would have to flip cards every time they wanted to make their creatures fight. This ability is so strong, in fact, that it makes me think it isn't actually passive, and maybe the effects of land cards are activated somehow. But they're already always exhausted, so it can't be flooping them, so I'm gonna put a pin in this until later, but my current thought is that the abilities of land cards are activated somehow by using cards that are in their land. Let's get into actual game mechanics now. Before lands are even on the board, I actually intend to make them the primary deck building element. The core idea is that the first thing you do in setup is select the 4 elements you'll be using for your lands, let's say hypothetically 3 cornfields and 1 useless swamp, which I'll talk about in a second. Then this means that you'll draw 6 random cards from each element you chose at the start of each game, to make a deck of 24 cards. So Jake would draw 6 corn cards 3 times, and then 6 useless swamp cards to make his deck. This way you can build synergies between elements, not just in the cards, but in the lands themselves. For those who haven't been following the project, deck building is mostly random during setup. Since the cards are so varied and unbalanced, it would be too crazy to allow players to build their own decks. Some cards are so much better than others that nobody would ever be willing to pick or use bad cards like we see used in the show. So instead, each element will consist roughly of 40 cards, which will all synergize with each other already. Bear in mind, I am not designing this game to be super competitive like other card games. Then of course, the land cards should have powers, or the creatures themselves should take advantage of them. I want the powers of the lands to be simple and broad. Not only should they synergize with their own decks, but if possible, some elements could have land passives that leave the door open for interesting synergies with other elemental cards, encouraging players to create their own mix instead of just rolling 4 of the same land always being the best play for synergy. Most land cards would have simple passive abilities, like my idea for the land cards in a door element, which, by the way, won the first round of voting and is the first locked-in community-contributed element. 6 more to go. All door lands would be considered adjacent to one another, which is really simple and not super complicated, but really powerful in certain situations. Land cards with more invasive abilities than that, like the wheat field, would be active and require a creature or structure on their lands to flip, making them vulnerable to trigger this ability. That said, the abilities of most land cards shouldn't be too invasive. I don't want them factored into every single interaction that happens on them, which is why having the other cards refer to them might work better than giving the lands themselves powers in most cases. So here's what I propose. Each element has multiple land options, a primary land with a very simple passive or no passive at all, which is what the other cards in the deck refer to for their abilities, like corn creatures drawing from cornfields for their power. So cornfields would be the primary land for the corn element. Then there would be other lands for the element which have abilities for themselves in exchange for not being related to the card abilities. This would allow for some interesting strategy, I think. Now beyond this, I mentioned the implied depth to the land mechanics that isn't depicted in the show. Having things be told but not shown is not anything new to me, so like the behavior cards and the economy system, I'll make this next part another optional mechanic. This proposed system will be called removable lands. So removable lands will expand on lands by allowing you to unfloop, destroy, and take over opponents' land cards. The concept behind unflooping and the destruction of land cards is derived from the fact that land cards in the show have what I'm assuming is a health stat, and that they aren't static since you need to floop them at the start of the game. Then if land cards can be destroyed, I just thought the idea of overtaking them was a logical next step to that. Destroying opponents' lands on its own is obviously good, but then being able to expand your own lands adds interesting strategies like increasing your cornfields or letting you play creatures into their kingdom. Right now the plan is that if you can clear an opponent's land of creatures and structures, then move one of your own creatures there, and then activate it without moving, it unfloops the land card. Unflooped land cards no longer provide their effects, passive or active, and they are also vulnerable to attack. I still need to iron out how exactly you target and damage land cards, but right now it would require a minimum of 3 turns to destroy a land card. Move into it, activate in it, and then attack it. All 3 of these actions are also reactable if your opponent has spells or floop abilities, even if they can't move creatures there. With some outside help, I also had the fun idea to make the land tiles puzzle pieces that fit together, or the board could have slots in it for different colored land rectangles. This is easy enough digitally, but if adapted to a real physical game would be a very different and complex story, since I wouldn't want to skyrocket manufacturing costs over it. There would/should also be ways to refloop your land cards, or to prevent the unflooping in different ways if it ends up being still too easy somehow, because even though this would be an optional mechanic, I don't want that to be an excuse for it to be the main focus and have it happening in every game if you decide to use it. Because in my opinion, optional mechanics should feel like natural expansions to the game instead of working like alternate game modes. My current ideas are to allow the defending player to flip a card in an adjacent land to the one that is having its land card unflooped to prevent that from happening. And then, if it is unflooped, the player can discard a card to refloop it, which is incredibly brutal in this game. If a land card does get destroyed, then the opponent's opposite land card takes over the space, so it now extends across the whole lane. This land would still be in your kingdom, but the opponent can play cards onto it and moving into it becomes easier. Now, it's very possible that even if a single one of your lands is taken, it's game over and you might as well have lost, but who knows? If you've got some big creatures out or still have a really crazy hand, I'm hoping it would just create some really exciting close games. I'm going to iron out these ideas and do some testing before the next video and let you know how it goes, but we'll now move on to my ideas for worker placement. Before I continue, I'd like to mention our memberships. If you sign up to become a member, you'll get access to future playtests 1 whole week early, just like this one, as well as sneak peek updates on videos and private members live streams where we workshop cards live, as well as some other stuff. Not to mention, we just held a members-only CardWars tournament. So if you'd like to participate in stuff like that in the future and support the project, please consider becoming a member. Jake calls out worker placement as a mechanic by name, and for a while I felt that for something stated as a distinct mechanic, it doesn't matter enough in my game, and the snippet they show doesn't match anything I have either. Plus, I was talking to someone about this and they flat out told me that what I had in the game wasn't worker placement and explained what it actually meant as a tabletop game mechanic. Honestly, I kind of already knew that given that I've played plenty of games with real worker placement, but it just never occurred to me or clicked in my head. The simplest example I can probably give is Catan. While they aren't called workers, the buildings you place between tiles are essentially workers. The main thing I'm missing from this is that in Catan, once you build a structure in a spot, it's taken, and you have to fight for these limited slots to get the resources you want. This also lines up with what we see in the show, one player's worker taking over and booting out their opponent's worker from a one worker slot. My biggest concern is that the economy stuff I have right now is working pretty well, and upending all of that to introduce a wacky worker placement idea might be too invasive and throw everything off. But what I've got rattling around in my head right now is that each lane is a limited slot for a worker, and placing a worker in a lane essentially claims that as yours or allows you to reap better rewards for producing money there. I still want to avoid having unique and varied resources because regardless of how funny that would be, it would bog the game down like crazy. I was also told that in order for it to actually be worker placement, workers as a resource need to be distinct from money. Otherwise, I'm essentially just buying a lane, not really placing a worker there. This stipulation might honestly be the hardest part to fill, so I'm sort of just giving you guys a heads up that this is very likely to change significantly, but I'm trying to work on a way to integrate it nicely with the economy mechanics I have already. I've been pretty laser focused on this land and worker stuff, plus the playtest, so I don't really have any general notes, but I do have some quick playtest notes I can throw at you. A common question I get is about the Centipede Wizard. It's phrased really poorly, but you reveal cards from your deck until you get a spell, set that aside, and shuffle your deck back together with the cards you revealed. If you didn't find a spell, Centipede Wizard dies. If you did, play the spell immediately. If you can't for some reason, like there is no valid target or you can't fill the cost, it is discarded and the Centipede Wizard dies too. Cannon Dweller's ability should probably be an activate ability, and yes, I know there are tons of spelling and grammar errors like it's instead of its, and Semi-Frozen Dino having a PB instead of an SFD somehow. I mean, come on guys, give me a break here. When I was picking my optional classes in school, I opted for How to Create a Show-Accurate Card Wars Public Prototype in Under 2 Months 101 over spelling. Regardless, please subscribe pretty please. Thank you so much for watching, and remember to subscribe. And man, if you guys could see these scripts, you'd really meet grinder me for all my poor grammar and spelling.